I still remember the day everything started falling apart like it was just another quiet morning on the Red Hollow Highway bend. The kind where the air smells like dust and overripe fruit, and you think nothing in your life is ever really going to change. But it did change. In a way I still can't fully explain without feeling that tight pressure in my chest. They bulldozed my roadside orchard without warning. No call, no notice. Just machines rolling in like my family's history with some inconvenience on a blueprint. And by the time I got there, it was already too late. Everything I grew up with was already gone. My name is Ethan Walker, and I used to think land was just land until I watched mine get erased in under an hour. That orchard had been there longer than I've been alive, planted by my grandfather back when that highway was barely more than a dirt strip cutting through open fields. He used to say every tree was a promise, something you leave behind so the world remembers you were here, and my father took that seriously in his own quiet way, selling fruit out of a wooden cart under those same trees, talking to truckers like they were old friends even if he had just met them 5 seconds earlier. And I grew up climbing those branches with sticky hands and stained shirts, learning the difference between seasons not from a calendar, but from the taste of mango turning sweet or guava going soft in your palm. So when I say it wasn't just land, I mean it was basically my childhood memory written in roots and bark, and somebody just decided to delete it. Across the road, things had changed fast, too fast. A massive development called Silverline Commons had been rising over the last year like it wanted to outshine everything around it. Glass walls, polished steel, neon signs promising luxury convenience, and modern living like it was some kind of religion. And I remember standing there more than once thinking how strange it was that progress always looks clean on the outside, even when it's built on something messy. I never thought much of it until the morning I saw the orchard gone. Just stumps sticking out of the soil like broken teeth, fruit crushed into the dirt, tire tracks pressed so deep it looked like the ground had been scarred on purpose. And I just stood there trying to understand how something that big could happen without anyone even looking me in the eye. Later that day, a project officer showed up while I was still standing in the ruins, clipboard in hand. Like this was just another checkbox on his schedule. He didn't even look uncomfortable, just polite in that rehearsed corporate way. And he said something like, site clearance was required for future frontage development. Organic vegetation reduces premium appeal. And I remember actually laughing for a second because I thought he had to be joking, but he wasn't. He looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable for caring. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger exactly, more like clarity, the kind that doesn't fade. That night, I drove slowly along the new service road leading into Silverline Commons, watching cars stream in like nothing had happened, families going shopping, music spilling out of open windows, lights reflecting off glass walls that had replaced what used to be open sky. And I kept thinking about how easily people accept change when they don't see what it costs. I probably would have just swallowed it like everyone expects you to, if I hadn't remembered something my father once mentioned years ago when I was barely paying attention. Something about zoning approvals and environmental buffers, legal conditions buried in paperwork that nobody reads twice. So the next morning I went digging, not in the soil this time, but in old files, municipal records, anything I could get my hands on. And what I found was almost too clean, too perfect in a way that felt dangerous, because buried in Silverline Commons' original approval was a condition that required a continuous green buffer zone along the highway edge. And guess what was listed as part of that buffer? My orchard. Not as decoration, not as optional landscaping, but as a legal requirement tied directly to their operating approval. Meaning if it was gone, their entire permission structure started to wobble. I didn't sleep much after that. Not because I was excited, but because I kept replaying every second of standing in that destroyed field, realizing it wasn't just a mistake. It was a shortcut someone took assuming nobody would ever connect the dots. The next step wasn't dramatic, at least not at first. I went to the municipal planning office carrying everything I had, old maps, photos of the cleared land, and a battered folder my father kept in a rusted toolbox like he somehow knew it might matter one day. And when the clerk started reading through it, I saw the change in his face, that slow recognition that this wasn't going to be easy to ignore. And that's when things started moving, quietly at first, then all at once. Inspectors were sent out, measurements were taken, reports were pulled, and within days I watched the same Silverline Commons that used to feel untouchable start to slow down, then stall, then freeze completely under a temporary suspension order. Construction didn't explode or crash in some dramatic way. It just stopped breathing, like someone had cut the air supply. And I'll stop here for now, because what happened next is where everything really turned, where the balance completely flipped and the people who thought they controlled the outcome suddenly realized they were part of it too. If you want to hear how it escalated from a frozen project into a full-blown confrontation at my front door, tell me to start the moment that suspension order hit Silverline Commons like a quiet earthquake, because nothing exploded, nothing caught fire, nothing dramatic. Like you'd see in a movie, it was worse in a way. Everything just slowed down, like somebody had taken the oxygen out of the whole project, and nobody quite knew who to blame first. I remember driving past the site that morning, same road, same entrance, but everything felt different. Cranes were still, workers standing around with nothing to do. Some of them leaning on concrete pillars like they were waiting for instructions that were never coming, and the huge glass front of the main building just reflected an empty kind of silence. There was a sign at the gate that hadn't been there before. Construction temporarily suspended pending environmental compliance review. And I swear, seeing those words printed so cleanly made it feel more real than watching my orchard get flattened. Inside the city offices, things were moving faster than I expected. Inspectors came back with more reports, more measurements, comparing old approval maps with what was actually on the ground now. And every time they found another mismatch, the tension around the project got tighter. I wasn't there for all of it, of course, but I could feel it happening like pressure building behind a wall. The interesting thing is, I didn't even have to push that hard after the first filing. Once the documentation was in motion, it wasn't about me anymore. It became procedural, almost mechanical. One inspector even told me, not officially but off the record, if that buffer zone requirement is real the way it's written, they're sitting on a compliance problem big enough to shut the whole frontage approval down. He didn't sound emotional, just tired, like he had seen too many projects built on assumptions instead of rules. That's when I started noticing the second wave of consequences, the kind nobody talks about when they say development progress. Retail investors started pulling back quietly, like they didn't want to be seen panicking. Lease agreements that were supposed to be signed within days suddenly needed internal review. And the marketing campaigns that had been blasting ads about luxury living and highway convenience went suspiciously quiet, like someone had unplugged the entire machine. But what really stood out to me was how fast people changed tone when uncertainty entered the room. The same project manager who had looked at me like I was just background noise suddenly started showing up at municipal meetings, asking questions about clarification timelines and potential remediation options, carefully chosen words, like language could somehow soften the fact that the ground beneath their approval was shifting. At home, I didn't feel victorious, not even close. I just felt awake in a way I hadn't before. I kept thinking about my father, how he used to say, "You don't win against machines by being louder, you win by understanding what they're built on." Back then I thought he was just talking about farming equipment, but now I realized he meant everything. 2 weeks into the suspension, things escalated in a way I didn't fully expect. I was sitting outside on my porch when a black SUV pulled up, clean, expensive, out of place on a road like mine. And when the door opened, the director of Silverline Commons stepped out. No cameras, no assistants, no polished presentation, just him and a kind of tired expression I hadn't seen before. He didn't start with threats or legal pressure like I expected. Instead, he said something like, "We didn't realize the buffer requirement was being interpreted this strictly," and I almost laughed because that was exactly the problem. They had assumed interpretation was optional. We stood there for a moment in silence, and I remember thinking how strange it was that this whole situation, all this damage, all this escalation, came down to people reading different versions of the same rules and choosing convenience over caution. He offered a package first, very polished, very corporate, replanting mature trees, installing irrigation systems, compensation for loss of crops, even something labeled emotional impact adjustment, which sounded like something invented in a boardroom that had never seen soil. I let him finish, because I wanted to see how far the offer would go before reality showed up. Then I told him my terms. I said I wanted full ecological restoration of the orchard using native species, not decorative replacements, not landscaping fillers, real restoration like it had to exist for the approval to exist, And I also wanted a permanent frontage fee structure if they intended to keep operating under that zoning framework, because if my land was legally part of their compliance system, then it wasn't just land anymore, it was infrastructure. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me for a long time, like he was recalculating everything he thought he understood about the situation. And then, surprisingly, he said they could agree, almost too quickly, like they were more afraid of delay than of cost. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't really about revenge, not in the way people imagine it. It was about leverage, about how fragile certainty really is when it's built on paperwork nobody expects anyone to actually enforce. But what I didn't know then was that agreeing wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much more uncomfortable conversation that would happen at my front door again, when pressure from investors, city officials, and the public started turning this into something much bigger than just a broken orchard and a stalled project. And I'll stop here, because part 3 is where everything comes to a head, including the final confrontation and the decision that changes who owns the story of that highway forever. Tell me to started with something I didn't expect after all that tension, silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind, like the whole highway bend was holding its breath and waiting to see who would blink first. Silverline Commons was still frozen, not collapsing, not recovering, just stuck in that uncomfortable middle where money keeps burning but nothing moves forward. A few days after that meeting at my porch, things got louder again, but not in the way you'd think. There were no machines this time, no inspectors walking through fields, just phone calls, meetings, emails flying between offices, and suddenly my name was showing up in places I never asked it to. Local news started circling the story, not fully naming me at first, just a land dispute affecting a major commercial development, but anyone who knew the highway bend knew exactly what it meant. I stayed out of it publicly, mostly because I wasn't interested in being turned into a symbol. To me it was still simple in a way. They took something that didn't belong to them, and the system eventually noticed. That's all. But systems don't stay simple for long once people start depending on them. Then came the second visit. This time it wasn't just the director. He came with a lawyer and someone from the city planning board, all three of them standing at my gate like they had rehearsed the conversation too many times in the car on the way over. The lawyer did most of the talking, of course, something about reinstating cooperation, mutual correction of compliance records, and reaffirming goodwill between parties, which is a funny way to describe a situation where one side bulldozed the other's history. The director looked different this time too, less confident, more careful. He said, "We're prepared to fully implement restoration, but the frontage fee structure you proposed is unconventional." He said it like he was trying not to insult me while also trying not to accept reality. I remember leaning on the fence, looking past them toward the empty stretch where the orchard used to be, and thinking how strange it was that the absence of something could still feel like pressure in a room. I told them very simply, "It's not unconventional. It's what your approval depends on." That line changed the air immediately. The lawyer tried to push back, talking about precedent, policy consistency, financial feasibility, but none of it mattered anymore, because the truth was already in the system file. Once something is written into compliance conditions, it doesn't care how expensive it becomes later. The real turning point came when the city representative finally spoke up, quietly, almost reluctantly, confirming what I already knew. If the buffer zone requirement was enforced exactly as written, then Silverline Commons couldn't fully reopen until ecological restoration was verified, not planned, not promised, actually verified. And that's when the entire dynamic flipped for good. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just said, "Then we restore it properly." What followed wasn't a victory parade. It was paperwork, inspections, approvals layered over corrections. Teams brought in to replant native species, redesign drainage, rebuild soil structure. It was slow, technical, almost boring from the outside, but for me it felt like watching time reverse in small, imperfect steps. But the most interesting part wasn't the restoration itself. It was how quickly everyone adjusted once they realized there was no shortcut out. Contractors stopped arguing. Executives stopped posturing. Even the city officials stopped pretending this was just an inconvenience. Because when the rules finally stop being theoretical, everyone suddenly becomes very precise. Weeks later, I stood at the edge of what used to be my orchard, now partially replanted, still young, still uneven, but real again in a way that mattered more than appearances. The highway was still there, the mall still stood across the road, but something between them had changed permanently. Not tension exactly, more like balance. Silverline Commons eventually reopened in a limited way, under stricter conditions than before. And yes, the frontage agreement became part of their operating structure. Nobody called it a win in public terms, but nobody could undo it either. One evening, I got a message from someone I didn't recognize, asking if I regretted what happened, if I thought it was worth it. I didn't answer right away. I just looked out at the young trees catching wind for the first time and thought about my grandfather, about my father, about everything that got erased, and then argued back into existence. I don't know if I would call it revenge. People like simple words for complicated outcomes. To me it felt more like correction. Slow, uncomfortable correction. And here's the part one know people will argue about. Some will say I went too far, that I weaponized paperwork instead of letting it go. Others will say I didn't go far enough, that I should have taken compensation and moved on. Maybe both are right in their own way. So I'll leave it with this question, because I still think about it even now. If something is legally required to exist for a system to function, and someone destroys it without consequence, who is actually breaking the system? The person who enforces the rule, or the people who ignored it first? If you've made it this far, I'd genuinely like to hear what you think. Was this justice, revenge, or just the system doing what it was always supposed to do?